What if I told you that nearly half of the people receiving U.S. food assistance aren't even American citizens, and that this revelation didn't come from a partisan blog, but from official admissions inside Washington itself? While politicians bicker over shutdowns, over 40 million Americans are staring at empty cupboards, and now officials are quietly confirming something that changes everything we thought we knew about SNAP benefits. Let's break it down. By the end, you'll see why this single issue could reshape everything you thought you knew. So let's set the stage. We're in the middle of a government shutdown that's dragging into its fourth full week. You've probably seen the headlines. Congressional Democrats are facing mounting pressure to end the standoff. It's not just coming from Republicans anymore. It's coming from within their own coalition. The head of the union, representing more than half of all federal workers, someone who typically backs Democratic priorities, has publicly demanded that Democrats accept the GOP's interim spending bill and put every single federal worker back on the job with full back pay. That's a remarkable shift. When your own allies start breaking ranks, you know the political ground is shifting beneath your feet. Now, Republicans are seizing on this moment. They're saying, look, we understand the reality of this situation. The administration has been shuffling money around trying to keep things afloat, but eventually you run out of funds and you run up against the bounds of the law. There's really nothing more they can do. Democrats, on the other hand, are pointing fingers at President Trump, saying he's absent without leave, more focused on foreign trips and ballroom events than brokering a deal here at home. It's the usual back and forth we've come to expect. But while lawmakers argued over procedure and optics, millions of families were facing a quieter emergency, their food benefits disappearing overnight. Across the country, more than 40 million people depend on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what used to be called food stamps, to put groceries on the table every week. That's not a small number. That's roughly 1 in 8 Americans. And as the shutdown dragged on, these folks started getting messages saying their benefits might not arrive at the beginning of the month. November 1st was the deadline. If the government didn't reopen, the program would freeze. No more funds. No more groceries. Think about that for a moment. For a single mother in Memphis, this isn't an abstract policy debate. It's whether her kids eat dinner tonight. It's whether she can afford both rent and food. The uncertainty alone is enough to keep you up at night. Local news stations started covering protests. People were gathering outside government offices, demanding answers. There was outrage. There was fear. And beneath all of that, there was a very real question: how did we get here? How did a program designed as a safety net for Americans in hard times become so fragile, so politicized, so stretched beyond its original intent? And that's where things get interesting. Because buried inside these reports, tucked away in the data that most networks weren't highlighting, was a fact that changes the entire conversation. Official numbers, not speculation, not rumor, but government data revealed that a very large share of people receiving SNAP benefits are not American citizens. We're talking about significant percentages. Immigrants from Afghanistan? Somewhere around half. Somali immigrants? Over 40%. Iraqis? About a third. Haitians? Nearly a quarter. And here's the kicker: estimates suggest that well over half of all undocumented immigrants in this country are collecting food stamps. Now, let me be clear, I'm not here to demonize anyone. If you're a human being and you're hungry, that's a problem we should care about. But this raises a fundamental question. How did a taxpayer-funded safety net designed to support Americans during tough times become a global subsidy? How did that happen, and why weren't we told? This isn't some fringe accusation. This is data that's been sitting in plain sight, and yet somehow it never made it into the center of the national conversation. Until now, because here's the twist, even Democrats are quietly confirming it. Behind closed doors, party strategists are admitting that the Biden-era immigration policies expanded eligibility in ways that are now politically untenable. That's their word, not mine. They know this is a losing issue. They know that when voters, especially seniors, veterans, working families, find out that their tax dollars are funding benefits for people who cross the border illegally, it doesn't sit well. It doesn't matter how compassionate the framing is. The math doesn't add up, and neither does the fairness of it. And it's not just anonymous strategists whispering in back rooms. Public figures are starting to speak up. Andrew Yang, who you might remember from the presidential primaries a few years ago. He's an independent now, not beholden to either party, went on CNN and said this could be an inflection point for Democrats. He pointed out that over 40 million Americans are on SNAP, and they're getting messages saying they're not going to get their usual benefits at the beginning of the month. So you have a lot of food insecure families heading into the holidays. And here's his key insight. If you're one of those families, you don't care whether it's Democrats or Republicans to blame. You just want to put food on the table. You're looking up at Washington and saying, what the hell is going on? Yang went further. He said, look, you're telling me you're willing to keep the government closed. You're willing to let over 40 million Americans go without the money they need to buy groceries, all to preserve leverage on healthcare subsidies? That's not going to work. Yes, Democrats have traditionally had the upper hand when it comes to healthcare. Most Americans trust Democrats more than Republicans on that issue. But when you're talking about healthcare versus food on the table, that's an entirely different conversation. And that's one Democrats will lose every single time, because hunger is immediate. It impacts someone right now. It's not theoretical, it's visceral. He wasn't alone in sounding the alarm. Even mainstream commentators who typically lean left started asking uncomfortable questions. Why are we prioritizing policy positioning over feeding people? Why are we allowing a safety net program to be stretched so thin that it can't even serve its original purpose? And more importantly, why did it take a government shutdown for this information to come to light? These are fair questions, and they're the kind of questions that, once asked, don't go away. But instead of addressing the core issue, instead of having an honest conversation about eligibility, about priorities, about who this program is really for, some activists decided to go after grocery stores. There's a viral video making the rounds where someone is demanding that supermarkets give back to the community. She's saying, look, you've made billions of dollars off families who pay with SNAP benefits and families who pay out of pocket. So now it's time for you to step up. Create a designated area where you can hand out boxes of food. Ask people a few questions, verify their need, and give. Don't put it all on food pantries, because they're already stretched too thin. And here's the punchline. Stop asking consumers for donations. The accountability, she says, should rest with you, the grocery stores. Now, I get the impulse. I really do. When people are scared and hungry, they look for someone to blame, someone to step in and fix it. But here's where the logic breaks down. Grocery stores are private, for-profit businesses. They operate on thin margins. They're not social service agencies. They don't owe the community free food any more than a car dealership owes the community free transportation. That might sound harsh, but it's important to understand how systems work. If we start mandating that private businesses foot the bill for public welfare, we're not solving the problem, we're just shifting the cost. And when you shift costs without addressing root causes, you create resentment, inefficiency, and ultimately, failure. This is where a little first principles thinking comes in handy. What's the actual goal here? The goal is to make sure people don't go hungry. So let's trace that back. Why are people going hungry? Because SNAP benefits are frozen due to a government shutdown. Why is the government shut down? Because Congress can't agree on a spending bill. Why can't they agree? Because both sides are using the shutdown as leverage for other priorities, healthcare, immigration, you name it. So the real problem isn't grocery stores. It's not even SNAP itself. The real problem is a broken incentive structure in Washington where political wins matter more than human needs. And until we fix that, we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. But let's zoom out even further, because there's a deeper structural flaw in how SNAP is designed. And this is something worth understanding, especially for those of us who've been around long enough to see how government programs evolve over time. There are really two groups of people who use SNAP. The first group is folks who've hit a rough patch, they lost a job, they're recovering from an illness, they're getting back on their feet. For them, SNAP is exactly what it's supposed to be, temporary assistance that bridges the gap until they're self-sufficient again. I have no problem with that. In fact, I think that's one of the best uses of taxpayer money. We're a wealthy country, we can afford to help our neighbors when they stumble. But then there's the second group. These are people who've been on SNAP for years, sometimes decades. They're not in transition. They're in a state of long-term dependence. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When you make it easy and comfortable to stay dependent, you reduce the incentive to change. That's not a moral judgment. That's just how human behavior works. Incentives drive outcomes. If I can meet my basic needs without working, or without working full-time, then why would I take on the stress and hassle of a job I don't want? Especially if that job doesn't pay much more than what I'm already getting for free. It's rational from an individual perspective, but from a societal perspective, it's a disaster. Because we end up with millions of people stuck in a holding pattern, neither thriving nor starving, just existing. And that's not compassion. That's warehousing human potential. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, that sounds cold. That sounds like blaming people for being poor. But that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that the system itself is flawed. It's designed in a way that traps people rather than liberates them. And if we really care about helping people, not just feeling good about ourselves, but actually improving lives, then we have to be willing to redesign the system. We have to ask hard questions. We have to be honest about what works and what doesn't. And we have to stop pretending that more money and more benefits automatically equal more compassion. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is create a path to independence, even if that path is uncomfortable in the short term. So where does immigration fit into all this? Well, that's where the policy contradictions become impossible to ignore. Over the past several years, we've had an open border approach that dramatically increased the number of people entering the country. Some came legally, many didn't. And regardless of how you feel about immigration as a moral or economic issue, the practical reality is this. Every person who enters the country and qualifies for benefits increases demand on a system that was already stretched thin. And here's the thing, the funding for these programs doesn't automatically expand just because more people show up. The pie stays the same size, but now you're cutting it into more pieces, which means each piece gets smaller. This is the political contradiction Democrats are wrestling with. On one hand, they advocate for generosity, open borders, expanded eligibility, compassion for everyone, regardless of status. On the other hand, they also advocate for fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, sustainable programs. But you can't have both. Not indefinitely. At some point, the math catches up with you. And that's exactly what's happening right now. The system is buckling under its own weight, and the people who suffer most are the very people the system was designed to protect American citizens who've paid into it their whole lives and now need it most. There's an old saying that fits here. When everyone's entitled to the pie, nobody bakes one. It's a bit simplistic, but there's truth in it. If you expand access without expanding production, you create scarcity. And scarcity breeds conflict. People start fighting over slices instead of cooperating to bake more pies. That's not a recipe for a healthy society. That's a recipe for resentment and division. And we're seeing that play out in real time. Now, let's talk about the economic reality of where this money actually comes from, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that. SNAP is funded by the federal government, which means it's funded by taxpayers, but the government doesn't have a magic money machine. It collects revenue through taxes, and it allocates that revenue through the budget process. When the government shuts down, certain expenditures are deemed non-essential and get frozen. SNAP is one of them, even though it's obviously essential to the people who depend on it. So what happens? The money doesn't disappear. It's still there. It's just locked behind a political stalemate. It's like having a fully charged battery but refusing to flip the switch because you're arguing over who gets to control the power. This is where the fragility of the system becomes painfully obvious. We've built a safety net that can be turned off overnight by political squabbling. That's not resilient. That's not robust. That's a single point of failure in a system that millions of people depend on for survival. And if you're one of those millions, that's terrifying, because you have no control over the outcome. You're not at the negotiating table. You're just waiting, hoping that the people in charge come to their senses before you run out of food. And this brings us to the tipping point. What happens if benefits actually stop? What happens if over 40 million people suddenly lose access to food assistance? Well, history gives us some clues. We've seen this kind of thing before. In the 1,970 seconds, when food prices spiked and aid programs faltered. There were strikes, protests, riots. In 2008, during the foreclosure crisis, entire neighborhoods erupted in anger when people felt abandoned by the system. Hunger doesn't just make people desperate, it makes them dangerous. Not because they're bad people, but because survival instincts override everything else. When you can't feed your kids, you stop caring about laws, norms, civility. You do whatever it takes. So if Democrats don't change course, if they let SNAP benefits run out to preserve leverage on some other policy priority, they're not just risking bad press. They're risking civil unrest. They're risking a political catastrophe that could haunt them for a generation. Because when people are hungry, they don't forget who let them go hungry. They don't forget which party was in power, which leaders refused to compromise, which system failed them, and they vote accordingly, or worse, they stop believing in the system altogether. This is why moderate voices like Andrew Yang are sounding the alarm. They see the writing on the wall. They understand that food is not a partisan issue. Hunger destroys ideology. You can't spin your way out of an empty stomach. You can't message your way around a crying child who doesn't understand why there's no dinner. At that point, all the high-minded policy debates, all the carefully crafted talking points, all the political maneuvering, it all becomes noise. What matters is action. What matters is results. So where do we go from here? How do we fix this? Because complaining about the problem is easy. Identifying solutions is harder, but it's necessary. And I think the path forward starts with reimagining what a safety net should actually look like in the 21st century. It shouldn't be a hammock that people can lie in indefinitely. It should be a trampoline that helps people bounce back. It should be temporary by design, with built-in incentives to transition off of it. And it should be transparent, accountable, and reserved for the people it was meant to serve, American citizens. That doesn't mean we ignore immigrants or refugees. It doesn't mean we lack compassion. It just means we have to be honest about capacity. If we want to help more people, we need to grow the economy, create more jobs, generate more tax revenue, expand the pie. But we can't do that if we're constantly redistributing a shrinking pie and calling it progress. That's not sustainable. That's not smart. And eventually, it collapses. Here's what reform could look like. First, verify citizenship. That's not radical. That's basic common sense. If a program is funded by American taxpayers for the benefit of American citizens, then eligibility should be tied to citizenship. If you're here legally but not yet a citizen, there can be pathways and exceptions, but they should be narrow and temporary. If you're here illegally, you shouldn't qualify. That might sound harsh, but it's the only way to preserve the integrity of the system. Because if everyone qualifies, then no one is truly protected. Second, embrace digital transparency. Right now, the system is opaque. It's hard to know who's receiving benefits, for how long, and why. That opacity breeds fraud, abuse, and suspicion. But we have the technology to fix that. We can create secure, privacy-protected databases that track eligibility in real time, flag anomalies, and ensure that aid is going to the people who genuinely need it. This isn't about surveillance. It's about accountability. And if we're going to ask taxpayers to fund these programs, we owe them the assurance that their money is being used wisely. Third, reward transitions. Instead of creating a cliff where benefits disappear the moment you earn $1 over the threshold, create a gradual ramp. Let people keep a portion of their benefits as they start working. Let them build savings without penalty. Let them feel like progress is possible without immediately losing the safety net. That's how you encourage self-sufficiency. That's how you turn dependency into opportunity. And that's how you rebuild trust in a system that, right now, feels rigged against anyone trying to improve their situation. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, this all sounds great in theory, but will it ever happen? Will politicians actually do the hard work of reform? And honestly, I don't know. I'd like to be optimistic. I'd like to believe that when the stakes are high enough, leaders rise to the occasion. But history suggests otherwise. History suggests that systems don't change until they break, until the pain becomes undeniable, until the consequences become unavoidable. And maybe that's where we are right now. Maybe this shutdown, this snap crisis, this admission from officials that the system is serving millions of non-citizens, maybe this is the breaking point that finally forces change. But here's the thing. Change doesn't happen because politicians suddenly grow a conscience. Change happens because people demand it. Because voters make it clear that the status quo is unacceptable. Because citizens show up, speak up, and hold their leaders accountable. And that's where you come in. Yes, you. Because if you're watching this, if you've made it this far, then you're paying attention, you're informed, you're engaged, and that puts you in a position to make a difference. You don't have to run for office, you don't have to organize protests, you just have to stay informed, ask questions, and vote accordingly. Your vote is your voice. Use it wisely. And beyond voting, use your influence in your own circles. Talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors. Share what you've learned. Not in a preachy way, not in a combative way, but in a thoughtful, curious way. Ask them what they think. Ask them if they knew about these numbers. Ask them if they're comfortable with how the system is working. Because the more people who understand the reality of the situation, the harder it is for politicians to ignore it. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. And right now, this issue needs a lot of sunlight. Let me also say this, especially to my older viewers. You've lived through a lot. You've seen systems change, leaders rise and fall, crises come and go. You've built this country with your work, your taxes, your sacrifices, and you have every right to expect that the safety net you paid into your whole life will be there when you need it. Not stretched thin by mismanagement, not diluted by expanding eligibility to people who never paid in, but strong, reliable, and focused on the people it was designed to serve. If that expectation makes you angry, good. Anger can be productive if it's channeled into action. But don't let that anger turn into cynicism. Don't give up on the system entirely, because for all its flaws, for all its inefficiencies, it's still the best system we have. And it can be fixed. It can be reformed. It can be made to work better, smarter, fairer, but only if enough people care enough to demand it. Only if we stop accepting empty promises and start insisting on accountability. Only if we treat policy like engineering, test, measure, iterate, improve. Not based on ideology, but based on results. So here's where we stand. Officials just admitted what many suspected: our food aid system has drifted far from its mission. Over 40 million Americans are left wondering if they'll eat next month, while politics gets in the way of progress. Families are scared, veterans are angry, seniors are feeling abandoned. And beneath it all is a structural problem that's been ignored for too long. We've expanded eligibility without expanding capacity, prioritized optics over outcomes, and allowed compassion to morph into dysfunction. The question now is simple. Do we let that slide, or do we finally demand efficiency, fairness, and accountability? Do we accept a system that treats taxpayers like an ATM with no limits, or do we insist on reform that actually helps people climb out of poverty instead of trapping them in it? Do we keep pretending that more spending equals more compassion, or do we grow up and admit that good intentions without smart design lead to disaster? I know where I stand. I think most of you do too. And I think if enough of us make our voices heard, change is possible. Not easy, but possible. Because the alternative, a system that collapses under its own weight, leaving millions with nothing, is unacceptable. We're better than that. We're smarter than that. And we owe it to ourselves, our kids, and our grandkids to fix this before it's too late. If you believe in solutions over excuses, hit that like button. It helps more people see this conversation. Subscribe if you want to stay informed without the noise. And drop a comment. What's your take on SNAP? Should benefits go only to citizens, or is there a middle ground? I'll be reading your thoughts below. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. And remember, the future isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build, one decision at a time.